Marvin Gaye is a man who needs no introduction. One of the most influential artists of the 20th century, his library of hit songs and records stands at a number that very few musicians could ever dream of reaching. However, despite the endless amounts of joy his music brought to the world, Gaye's personal life was marred with tragedy, drug addiction, and ultimately an untimely murder at the hands of his very own father. Today, we take a look at the life and death of one of the most renowned artists in history, Marvin Gaye. Marvin Pence Gaye Jr. was born in Washington, D.C. on April 2, 1939. His mother, Alberta, was a domestic worker, and his father, Marvin Sr., was a minister at a local Pentecostal church. His family was extremely religious, and basically lived at the church where his father preached. They followed a very interesting brand of Christianity, acknowledging the New Testament but refusing to celebrate any holidays that could be considered pagan, such as Christmas and Easter, and instead observing Orthodox Jewish holidays. And when I say they practically lived at church, that is not an exaggeration. Reportedly, they would run services up to 5 days a week, and on Sundays it wasn't uncommon for people to stay in worship for 12 to 18 hours a day, and sometimes even longer than that. You might think that all this worshiping would lead to a happy household, but the Gaye household was anything but that. Marvin Sr. was a tyrant who made a habit of beating his wife and children. And I know when you start getting into what is and isn't the right way to discipline your kids, people can get a little defensive. But I don't think any sane person would argue Marvin Sr. didn't go too far. He would beat Marvin and his siblings seemingly for no reason at all. And this wasn't just normal slaps. He would force his children to strip naked and then beat them across their back and rear using a belt or switch until they were bleeding. Something he did to Marvin as well as his brothers and sisters well into their late teens. Of all the children, though, Marvin definitely got the worst treatment. His father seemed to have a burning hatred for his son even in his early childhood, something that was obvious to everyone in the family, including his mother as well as aunts and uncles. Many felt this anger stemmed from jealousy. As a young boy, Marvin's first experience with music was singing in church, where his performances would garner standing ovations from the congregation. When Marvin Sr. took to the stage to deliver his sermons, however, even on his best days, he didn't get a small portion of the love and adoration his son did. Unlike most parents who would want their children's performances to get celebrated in such a way, this just made Marvin Sr. angry, and he would take his anger out on his son. This would go on to have a substantial impact on the young Marvin's mental health. He struggled with depression and thoughts of suicide, something that would continue to plague him for the remainder of his life. Throughout all this, Marvin's one solace was music. He mastered drums and piano at a very young age and became something of a savant with gospel music. As he reached high school and progressed through his teenage years, his taste in music expanded to R&B and doo-wop, which would become the foundation for his career in the coming years. As a student at Cardozo High School, he joined several doo-wop groups and quickly realized music was something he could make a name for himself in. However, his relationship with his father also worsened during these years, and desperate to get away from his household, Marvin dropped out of school in 1955 and joined the Air Force shortly after. His career as an airman didn't last long, though. Marvin despised doing the mundane tasks that the Air Force required of him. According to his superior officers, he was very rebellious and often faced discipline for refusing to follow orders. Not long after joining, Marvin was looking for a way out. Initially, he wanted to try and fake mental illness, but he confessed later that by the time of his discharge, it was no longer an act. He was given an honorable discharge that simply stated he, quote, cannot adjust to regimentation or authority, and returned home to D.C. in 1957. Feeling like a failure due to his falling out of the Air Force, Marvin chose not to return home and face his father, who he knew would ridicule him for not being able to make it in the military. Shortly after, he formed a doo-wop group called the Marquis with 3 of his friends, performing anywhere and everywhere that would have them so they could try and get their name out. The group floundered around the local scene until one day where they caught the eye of blues musician Bo Diddley. Impressed by their talent, Bo tried to have them signed to his record label, but label executives were not as impressed and elected to put the group on a subsidiary label instead. They soon released a single titled Wyatt Earp, which had been co-written by Diddley. However, the song failed to gain any traction on the charts, and the group was soon dropped from the label. Rather than letting the failure of his first swing at the industry get him down, Marvin used it as motivation. The close brush with fame made him realize his dream was possible. He just needed to retool his approach and make some changes so he could finally get there. He began composing his own music afterwards, tapping into his background as a gospel musician and trying to blend it with the nightclub-style blues that he'd been exposed to during the early days of the Marquis. The group continued to move around within the industry, taking jobs as session musicians and background vocalists before breaking up in 1960. Marvin relocated to Detroit and continued to work as a session musician. Then in December of that year, gave a performance that would change the trajectory of his life forever. Marvin performed at a Christmas party for Berry Gordy, who had recently formed the now famous Motown record label. At this point, Motown was a far cry from the star-studded roster of famous musicians it would become throughout the decade, and Gordy's eye for talent would end up netting him the person who'd go on to be one of his label's most celebrated artists. He was immensely impressed with Marvin and approached Harvey Fuqua, who was the current owner of Marvin's contract, and inquired about purchasing it from him. Harvey agreed to a partial sale of the contract rights, and Gaye was signed to the Motown subsidiary Tamla Records. Marvin was initially hesitant to embrace the soulful R&B style of music that would define most of his later career. Being a very religious person, the overt sexual nature of that style of music was something he was never completely comfortable with, even though he was a fan. His first album, titled The Soulful Moods of Marvin Gaye, was released in 1961 and didn't make much buzz in sales or the charts. Undeterred, he continued to work as a session singer and sought advice from other musicians as to how he could be more charismatic on stage. In 1962, he co-wrote a song for the Marvelettes entitled Beechwood 45789, on which he played drums that would go on to become the first top 10 hit with his name on the writing credits. That September, he released a single entitled Stubborn Kind of Fellow that reached the top 10 on R&B charts and the top 50 overall. With 2 bona fide hits under his belt now, Marvin's confidence in his ability to become a successful musician was now at an all-time high. But even he could not have foreseen the unbelievable heights his career would reach over the next decade. In 1962, Marvin released his second studio album, That Stubborn Kind of Fellow, that included his single from the prior year. In 1963, he recorded 2 more top 10 hits with the songs Pride and Joy and Can I Get a Witness. A live rendition of the latter, performed at the Apollo Theater, propelled him to international fame, becoming his first top 10 hit in both American and foreign music charts. In just a few short years, Marvin had gone from an obscure session musician that few people outside of the Motown record label knew to a machine for top 10 hit singles. His father was still very dismissive of his son's success, even with that success bringing newfound financial stability to their family. Marvin Sr. seemed as jealous and vindictive of his son as he had always been, never even acknowledging Jr.'s success and seemingly going out of his way to tear down Marvin's accomplishments. Gaye also entered into a relationship with Berry Gordy's sister, Anna, who was 17 years his senior. The two had gotten romantically involved when Marvin first signed with Motown and were eventually married in 1963. Their marriage, though, was fraught with conflict from almost the beginning. All of this, though, didn't stop him from achieving the most successful period of his career to date. In 1964, he released the song How Sweet It Is to Be Loved by You, which went on to become his biggest hit yet, reaching number 5 in the Billboard charts. In 1965, he recorded a duet with singer Kim Weston entitled It Takes Two that was a top 20 hit. A year later, he would begin working with up-and-coming singer Tammy Terrell on a series of duets that would go on to become the stuff of music legend. Their singles included Your Precious Love, Ain't Nothing Like the Real Thing, You're All I Need to Get By, and most famous of all, Ain't No Mountain High Enough, which became one of the most recognizable songs in American history and resulted in Marvin's first #1 hit on the Billboard Top 100. Soon after, he would release his first solo #1 hit with 1968's I Heard It Through the Grapevine. Gaye and Terrell would go on to become Motown's royal couple, with Marvin earning the nickname the Prince of Motown. Unfortunately, like too many things in Marvin's life though, this collaboration that seemed to have an endless well of potential also ended in tragedy. In 1967, Terrell was diagnosed with a brain tumor that robbed her of her ability to perform on stage at just 22 years old. She would endure a total of 8 surgeries over the next 3 years, all of which were unsuccessful, before passing away in 1970 at just 24 years old. Marvin was absolutely devastated by the loss of someone he saw as his musical soulmate, and sank into a deep depression following her death. To make matters worse, Gaye began to have a falling out with Gordy and the Motown label. They had essentially abandoned Terrell in the final years of her life, offering little to no financial support once they realized the young singer was never going to be the same even if she had recovered from her cancer. This enraged Marvin and made him realize that the label cared little for the lives and well-being of their artists, despite their words to the contrary. The Prince of Motown was, in his mind, a prince without a kingdom, and the death of Terrell took away the one solace he had in his entire life. As a result, the singer turned to the one thing that all too many musicians turn to in their darkest moments: drugs. Marvin developed an addiction to cocaine that would go on to plague him for the rest of his life, and briefly considered retiring from the music industry. Marvin returned to recording in June of 1970, writing the legendary anthem What's Going On, a ballad that many consider one of, if not the defining song of his career. However, when Motown executives first heard the anthem, they felt it was too political for the radio and refused to release it. Marvin responded by a protest of his own, refusing to record any music for the label for the rest of 1970. Eventually, Motown relented and released the single in 1971, where it garnered massive critical acclaim, reaching #2 on the Hot 100 and becoming the second most successful song of Marvin's solo career. He returned to Detroit to record an album to release alongside the single, under the condition that he be given full creative control over his music, something the studio reluctantly agreed on. Whether executives liked it or not, Marvin had become a star that they needed more than he needed them, and this was a position the singer quickly realized. In 1971, he signed a new deal with the label, where he demanded a premium payday that executives again reluctantly agreed on. At $1 million, the deal was, at the time, the richest deal for an African-American artist in the music industry. Despite the hefty investment, though, the label and Gaye would continue to clash throughout the decade. Gaye's music was becoming not only more political, but also much more overtly sexual, as indicated by the 1973 hit Let's Get It On, which has not only gone on to become America's unofficial sex anthem, but became Marvin's second #1 hit on the top 100. Later that year, he finally divorced his wife Anna, putting an end to their tumultuous marriage, but resulting in a bitter legal battle over alimony. And by this point, financial struggles were becoming a defining feature of Gaye's life. His cocaine habit had absorbed an astronomical amount of his money, as did his now very hedonistic lifestyle that involved almost nightly binges with drugs and prostitutes. Marvin later admitted that he felt like his whole life was a struggle between an angel and a devil waging war inside of him, and that during this period of his life, the devil was clearly the one winning. His financial struggles coincided with something he hadn't experienced for a long time: professional struggles. After a successful tour throughout Belgium in 1976 and another string of successful albums, Marvin closed out the decade on a bit of a downturn. He released 2 albums that were panned critically and failed to perform to his typical standard commercially. His spending habits combined with this put him in a situation where he was quickly burning through his money. And by 1980, the IRS was knocking on the door, as Gaye owed back taxes in upwards of $4.5 million. He embarked on another European tour, and at the end of it decided not to return home to the US, and moved to London, fearing that if he did come back, he'd be arrested for tax evasion. Gaye would spend the next couple of years in Europe, eventually moving to Belgium, where for a time he managed to kick his drug addiction. This time in Europe gave Marvin a new lease on life and helped renew his passion for music, which he blamed for his lackluster releases to end the 1970s. While living overseas, he began laying the foundation for his eventual comeback and reached a settlement with the IRS. Most significantly, though, he left Motown Records and signed with CBS in 1982. After a 20-year partnership with the label that had shot him to international stardom, the Prince of Motown was leaving. Returning from Europe in 1982, Marvin released his next album, Midnight Love, with its first single titled Sexual Healing, that would become the biggest hit of Marvin's career, spending a whopping 10 weeks at the #1 spot in Billboard's Top 100 and gaining Marvin his first 2 Grammy wins. Almost overnight, Marvin was catapulted back into superstardom. He began touring again in 1983 to sell out crowds, but unfortunately fell back into drug addiction, which caused the tour to be plagued with issues due to his drug-filled paranoia. At the end of the year, Marvin moved to his parents' home in LA, once again attempting to kick his cocaine addiction for a final time. The tumultuous relationship with his father was still present, though, and the two often butted heads and got into explosive arguments, which would come to a deadly peak in early 1984. One day before Marvin's 45th birthday, he walked in on his father and mother in the middle of a bitter argument over an insurance letter that Marvin Sr. couldn't find. Fearing that his father was going to get violent, Marvin intervened, taking his mother's side and telling his father to go upstairs and leave her alone. Marvin eventually took his mother into his room to be away from his dad, who continued yelling expletives from the hallway at both his son and wife. Marvin shouted a warning back at his father to not enter the room, a warning that Marvin Sr. disregarded. His father came into the room and began yelling at his mother, which caused Marvin to jump out of his bed and begin pushing his father out of the doorway, as well as punching and kicking him several times. His body and pride wounded, Marvin Sr. went to his room and retrieved a .38 caliber pistol from his nightstand, and without warning, returned to his son's room, firing a fatal shot into his chest. The bullet went right into Marvin's heart, and he collapsed on the floor and died instantly at 44 years old. His mother ran downstairs and called the police, who arrived on scene and placed Marvin Gaye Sr. under arrest. As news broke, the world was stunned to hear of the loss of such an influential artist who had touched the lives of millions around the world, and were equally stunned to hear that he had been killed by his very own father. Though family and friends who knew of the relationship the two had said they weren't entirely surprised. Marvin Sr. was charged with first-degree murder, though the charges were eventually lowered to involuntary manslaughter. During the trial, it was discovered that Marvin Sr. also had been diagnosed with a brain tumor months earlier, which led to the presiding judge, Gordon Ringer, giving him a very light sentence of 6 years, all of which was suspended, and 5 years of probation. In court, a tearful Marvin Sr. claimed that the entire thing was just one horrific accident, saying, quote, "If I could bring him back, I would. I was afraid of him. I thought I was going to get hurt. I didn't know what was going to happen. I'm really sorry for everything that happened. I loved him. I wish he could step through this door right now. I'm paying the price." Understandably, given his history of physical and emotional abuse against his family, many did not buy this regretful speech. Alberta filed for divorce almost immediately, and Marvin Sr. would live the rest of his life ostracized by his family. His health eventually degraded to the point he needed full-time care, and he was placed in a nursing home where he died at 84 years old in 1996. Perhaps the biggest tragedy of Marvin Gaye's life is that despite bringing happiness to millions of people, happiness always seemed to elude him. With the search for self-fulfillment always just out of reach, Marvin admitted at the end of his career he was no longer making music to find pleasure for himself, but to give pleasure to others. "I record so that I can feed people what they need, what they feel. Hopefully I record so that I can help someone overcome a bad time." With a legacy as one of the greatest musicians to ever live, I think it's safe to say Marvin Gaye accomplished his goal. This is Crime Spot, and thank you for watching.